In the Tom Hanks film Bridge of Spies, the culminating scene is the exchange of Soviet spy Rudolph Abel and American spy pilot Francis Gary Powers. But the story of Powers has an interesting backdrop. The Cold War was at its height, and the U.S. had been flying Lockheed U-2 high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft operated by the Central Intelligence Agency and flown by military pilots. The dangers posed by the Soviet Union were taken seriously, and the Eisenhower Administration wanted to know more about Soviet capabilities, especially their nuclear missile launch sites. Who was Francis Gary Powers? What was the U-2 spy program? When did that program begin, and how? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, military veteran, historian, author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. After the Soviets achieved an operational atomic bomb in 1949 and a hydrogen bomb in 1953, the fears of a nuclear-capable communist enemy forced the U.S. government into action. Kelly Johnson of Lockheed and his Skunk Works had developed a lot of aircraft, and one of these was the U-2. Penetrating the Iron Curtain had proven far more challenging than U.S. intelligence agencies had anticipated. The vast size of the Soviet Union made it difficult to survey, and when surveillance aircraft were sent to the edges of Russian airspace, they were often shot down by Soviet forces. The U-2 had the design appearance of a powerless glider with a very long tapered wing. This wing made up 1/3 the weight of the aircraft, which allowed a range of about 3,000 miles while carrying up to 700 pounds of photo reconnaissance equipment to an altitude of over 70,000 feet. The U-2 was specifically designed and deployed as a high-altitude spy plane and was first flown over the USSR in 1956, which allowed the U.S. to get clear photographic images of Soviet missile sites, locations, and infrastructure. Eisenhower was personally pleased with the intelligence collected by the secret flights, proving evidence that Soviet nuclear capabilities were significantly less advanced and therefore not as great a threat as had been claimed by Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Basically, the U.S. was in far better shape in numbers and capabilities when comparing both nations' nuclear arsenals. This comfort zone was established due to the U-2, although not a very fast aircraft, having the altitude capability of flying out of the reach of Soviet surface-to-air missiles and fighter interceptors. U.S. intelligence was well aware of Soviet radar capabilities and believed that it was only a matter of time before their surface-to-air missiles, or SAM, capabilities were increased. Eisenhower placed a temporary halt on flights for a few months as modifications were being made to the U-2. The flights over the Soviet Union resumed in June 1957 from Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska to the Russian Far East, especially around Kamchatka and Sokolov, which had less effective radar systems. With the newer and more powerful Pratt & Whitney J75 P-13 engine, the maximum altitude of the U-2 was now 74,600 feet, further frustrating Soviet commanders. Lahore and Peshawar, Pakistan, were other prime locations, and a departure flight on August 5th from Peshawar provided the first photographic evidence of the Baikonur Cosmodrome near Tehran, which was completely unknown to the U.S. until that mission. Additional U-2 missions provided detailed intelligence on the Semipalatinsk nuclear and Saryshgan missile test sites. Silver Moor flights occurred that year, with pilots having a few near misses with advanced Soviet SAMs, but the CIA was not concerned. They should have been, and Eisenhower wanted caution. Eisenhower was also less than pleased when the Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite in October 1957, which was a shock to the intelligence community and gave the U.S. and Western democracies a black eye. But there was another major issue Eisenhower was dealing with. Eisenhower had been working with the USSR on getting a nuclear test ban agreement signed, even while spying on them. More disturbing news came when it was proven that the Soviets were launching interceptors and SAMs at U-2s on their radar that were not even in Soviet airspace. Pakistan, Norway, and even the Aleutian Islands saw territorial violations by the Soviets, but little could be said about it without divulging the top-secret U-2 program. In April 1958, Pyotr Semyonovich Popov, a double agent, told his handler in the CIA, George Kiesefelter, that a senior KGB official had boasted of having full technical details of the U-2. The source of the intelligence leak was never identified, but there was the belief that Lee Harvey Oswald, the assassin or assumed assassin of John F. Kennedy, who was assigned as an air traffic controller and radar operator at the military base in Atsugi, Japan, which also operated the U-2. Meanwhile, the Soviets had been working on their air defenses, being well aware of the U-2 reconnaissance flights because they could track the aircraft on radar, but unable to stop them. The Soviets enhanced their anti-aircraft missile systems. After 4 years of frustration at the U-2 flights, the Soviets had, by the spring of 1960, developed the Zenith surface-to-air radar-guided missile with a longer range. This was not unknown to the CIA or U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers, but they felt it was worth the risk. On May 1st, Gary Powers, whose flight plan was to fly on a 9-hour mission from his base in Lahore, Pakistan, and land in Norway, took him over central Russia, where most of the missile sites were located. Flying at the maximum altitude of 74,600 feet, Powers' U-2, while passing over Yekaterinburg, Russia, was rocked by the proximity explosion of a nearby SAM, which damaged his aircraft and forced him to a lower altitude where a second missile made a direct hit. Powers stated in his own words, "Suddenly there was a dull thump." Powers wrote in a memoir, "The aircraft jerked forward and a tremendous orange flash hit the cockpit and lit up the sky. Powers ejected and was captured on the ground." Eisenhower and the CIA believed that the aircraft was totally destroyed and Powers was dead, hence their attempt at covering up the incident. They believed that little evidence of the plane's espionage mission had survived the crash, so they responded that the aircraft was merely a weather plane that had accidentally flown off course. On May 5th, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet military had brought down an American spy plane, but no mention was made of Powers. The cover story was blown wide open when the Soviets produced photographs of Powers and parts recovered from the wreckage that proved that it was a spy aircraft. The nuclear limitation talks died almost immediately. The event forced Eisenhower to admit that the U.S. was responsible for the spy missions, which damaged the intelligence community. Allied U-2 operations with the British in Turkey and Japanese were abandoned as a result, and all detachments were then centralized at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Powers was convicted of espionage by a Soviet court and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Yet, as luck would have it, Soviet embedded spy Rudolf Abel was captured in New York by chance. The diplomacy to exchange the two spies started. Of interest, Powers had carried a syringe filled with potassium cyanide so that he could commit suicide should he risk capture. His failure to do so saw him labeled a coward in many circles. Of greater interest, Powers did not suffer the notoriously brutal interrogation methods given to many under that system. He was questioned, but he apparently gave nothing of any value to the Soviets. However, a CIA inquiry into the ordeal found that Powers had handled himself appropriately. The organization bestowed upon him its highest honor, the Intelligence Star for Bravery. Powers and Abel were traded on February 10th at Checkpoint Charlie, the dividing line on the bridge over the Berlin Wall, with Alexandrovich Shishkin, the second secretary of the Soviet embassy, as the handler. The U-2, called the Dragon Lady for its difficulty to fly, remained in service for many years, but the next U-2 shot down was over Cuba, flown by Major Rudolph Anderson during the Cuban Missile Crisis. These two events saw the increased development of the SR-71 Blackbird, which would be the fastest and highest flying spy plane in history, continuing spy flights over the communist world. None were ever shot down. Over the decades, the U-2 was upgraded, yet the basic cockpit design remained the same. The later model U-2 uses a lightweight and fuel-efficient General Electric F-118-101 engine, so it does not require mid-air refueling during long missions. The maximum range of the U-2 was extended up to 6,090 nautical miles with a speed of around 410 miles per hour. It is still in use today. Following his service to his country, Francis Gary Powers worked as a helicopter pilot for a Los Angeles TV station until he was killed in a helicopter crash in 1977 and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. Thanks for watching today's episode of Forgotten History. If you like this episode, please consider becoming a channel member or joining our Patreon page. This would help us offset the ever-increasing cost of production. As always, please like, share, and comment. And if you have any show ideas, please contact us, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Until next time.